You are listening to an Eyes on Washington podcast brought to you by Holland and Knight's Public Policy and Regulation Group. Our Public Policy and Regulation Group is a strong bipartisan team with deep ties throughout Washington, D.C. We have built a thriving government affairs practice through our depth of experience and diversity and by maintaining our bipartisan approach. Our State Attorneys General podcast series is hosted by former Deputy Attorney General of Virginia and presidential appointee at the U.S. Department of Commerce, Stephen Cobb. Through conversations with State Attorneys General, this series will dive into the importance and growing role of State Attorneys General while hearing firsthand on what they are working to accomplish in their communities.
Welcome to another installment of Holland and Knight's Eyes on Washington podcast, State Attorneys General Edition. My name is Stephen Cobb. I'm a partner in Holland and Knight's Washington, D.C. office, former Deputy Attorney General of Virginia, and co-chair of Holland and Knight's State Attorneys General practice. With me today is my fellow co-chair and law partner, Jim Schultz out of Philly. Jim, great to be here on the podcast with you.
Great to be on with you again, too, Stephen. There's some exciting things going on around the country politically right now.
Absolutely. So one of the things, we've done so many of these podcasts talking with state AGs and senior leadership in state AG offices, focusing in on the substance of those offices. But as you know, and as our listeners may know, for the most part, state attorneys general are themselves elected statewide officials. And so I want to say the number is 46 out of the 51, including DC, are popularly elected. And so, like so much going on right now, it is election season, and many of them are going to be in tight contests. So I thought today that we kind of talk a little bit about what the political environment looks like nationally, what it looks like in some states specifically, and then talk about how that might impact some of the priorities and politics of state attorneys general. So with that, Jim, what are your kind of thoughts? Well, let's start macro. In your mind, where do things look as far as the 2022 cycle, and how do you think that's going to affect state AGs?
Look, I think you're going to see, if all things kind of remain the way they are now, you're going to see a pretty much a red wave sweeping across the country, largely because, especially in some of these swing states, Biden's numbers are in the tank. We're seeing that in Pennsylvania, where I'm from. And you're seeing, I think we're going to see huge gains in Congress. You're going to see some very competitive Senate races in places where I think that, wouldn't normally be competitive. And at the state level, you're going to see some very competitive gubernatorial races in places where Republicans haven't normally been competitive. But I think, very telling is the AG races. And I think there's going to be some, in some of these swing states, some very competitive races, and in places where Democrats traditionally had strongholds.
It's interesting you say that. One of the things that I've noticed that I keep telling folks over the last few years is that state AGs are themselves becoming such a force within their own states that you can't always predict the state AG race by the national trends. And by that, I mean, if you looked at the 16 cycle and the 2020 cycle, you often saw state AGs overpowering the top of the ticket with their vote share. So with Democrats in particular in those cycles, you're looking at the Joshes, Shapiro and Stein in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, respectively, running ahead of the presidentials in their states. I'd be interested in your thoughts, Jim, on kind of how you see that. And of course, the same is true with many Republican AGs. And I'd be interested in getting your thoughts. From my perspective, there is part of this that is the old Tip O'Neill, all politics is local, and that state AGs, more so than their counterparts in the U.S. Senate or in presidential politics, have a stronger connection to local communities across the state, which allows them to cut through, sometimes by a fraction of a point, sometimes by several points, some national trends. What are your thoughts?
I think some of it is also attributed to the fact that you have Democratic elected attorneys general in states like Pennsylvania, right, where we didn't have, up until Josh Shapiro, we had one other elected Democratic attorney general in Kathleen Kane. But up until Kathleen Kane, we hadn't had a Democratic elected attorney general. They were all Republicans. So what I think you see in a state like ours, where you have cross-pressure issues, specifically law enforcement issues, where Democrats can, move more towards the center and center right on law enforcement issues, it has an ability for them to have real impact in swing states. And I think that's what we've seen out of Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. He's taken on violent crime issues very aggressively. He's taken on gun crime issues very aggressively in this state. And I think that's largely the reason why he's been able to be so successful in a state like Pennsylvania, is because he's been able to take these traditionally Republican law enforcement issues and turn them into a positive for himself by just doing the job.
100%. And one of the other things that I think is interesting is that there is a large part of the state AG portfolio, as listeners know who've listened to our podcast previously, that focus on kind of apolitical issues like consumer protection, like competition issues, like data privacy issues. And you start to see those cut across traditional political lanes, such that incumbents in particular tend to be able to campaign on accomplishments in consumer protection and antitrust and data privacy. And their campaigns become a referendum on how effectively they've been able to improve the lives of day-to-day constituents.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, especially, protection of children, protection of minors. There's a lot of great issues, not just the commercial issues, but the ones that really impact people's daily lives in the consumer protection space, like you said, that really allow AGs to gain real name ID and then become successful down the road. And there's always kind of the insider's joke that Attorney General also stands for aspiring governor as well.
So true. So let's get into the map. I think about half the states are up this cycle, but even though half are up, a much smaller number have risk of flipping, and an even smaller number are other issues of losing incumbency. So let's kind of break these down. First, why don't we go through some of the states that I know from the Democratic side, I don't think are at risk of losing a Democratic incumbent. You have a bunch of those in the Northeast. You have New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, although the incumbent is running for governor, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, New Mexico, California. While all of these states are on the ballot this November, I don't think that those are inherently in concern of competitive races. Obviously that can always change. What about the Republican side? There's a bunch up. Which ones do you see not being competitive and are say for that?
I think the lion's share of the traditional Republican states are going to just, the red states are going to continue to be red, right? Especially in this environment. So without going through the list, I do think that most of the incumbent Republican seats are in good shape. I know there has been some question about Texas, but I do think that Texas is going to solidly remain in the red as it relates to the Attorney General race. Interesting state, right, to talk about though on the swing side of it. I think for a pickup for the Republicans is Iowa. So Iowa, we have a sitting Attorney General, Tom Miller, Democratic elected Attorney General. How many years has he been in office? I think it's 11 terms now, right?
Yeah, I want to say it's like 42 years or something.
Yeah,
overall. General Miller is the longest serving state Attorney General in the history of the United States.
But I think we've seen a trend now in politics that incumbency isn't always a good thing, right? And I think you become part of the problem if you're in there for a long time. We're also seeing kind of the red wave making its way across the country and, with Biden's numbers in the tank. So in a place like Iowa, we have the Republicans have Guthrie County Attorney Brenna Byrd, who's an old friend of mine from the days when she was general counsel to the governor of Iowa and when I was general counsel to the governor of Pennsylvania. And she's run for the office before. She didn't win the last time. She's running unopposed in the primary. And she is the leading candidate, is a leading, targeted race for the Republicans this year to sink money into it to pick up that seat.
Well, not surprisingly, I'm going to push back and disagree with you slightly there in Iowa. I think Tom Miller has been elected over 4 decades because I think he really represents needs of Iowans in that office. And I think when you look at some of the demographics of folks and where it splits on partisan lines, I think you've seen decade in, decade out, Tom Miller being able to draw from across the aisle. And when you have somebody going into a race against somebody that they've already beat before, I mean, you know this from a kind of campaign perspective, you already have those voter IDs, you know where your voters are and when to touch. So I'm going to be incredibly surprised. I know it's going to be a hard fought race, but I'm going to be surprised if Tom Miller, it doesn't.
Yeah, Stephen, you're comfortable. You're real comfortable being in the wrong, right? Because we talked about this about a year ago when we were talking about the state of Virginia and how that was gonna continue its trend to be in blue, and we saw what happened there. So I think in a state where Trump's won by 9 points in 2020, I do believe it's ripe for a pickup for Republicans.
Oh, I didn't say it wouldn't take work, but yeah, to the point in Virginia, Mark Herring, my former boss, still punched ahead of the top of the ticket, which just shows, and further underlines that connections that I think state AGs have, perhaps as a statewide, perhaps greater so than anyone, be that a governor or a state senator moving forward.
Another place where you have a potential pickup for Republicans is Nevada, where you have Attorney General Aaron Ford. The Republicans feel pretty good about this race. I think there are two people in the primary thus far. I think the person who's I've seen the most of is a former classmate of mine from law school, is Sigal Chattah. She's been working very hard. She's Israeli born, came to the United States as from Israel, and created a law career there that included taking on some pretty controversial issues when she was there. For instance, the closure of the state capitol, the closure of the synagogues and the churches. She filed lawsuits there to open those up and got wins on them. So I think that's something that may resonate with Nevada voters.
It's interesting. Nevada is one of those states. I can't say enough good things about Aaron Ford. I believe he holds 5 degrees, including a PhD in education, if I'm not mistaken. Just wonderful leader out there. But I'm also, with his high favorabilities and that of also, I believe, Senator Cortez Masto, who's also up. I'm wondering if some of these states where you have the U.S. Senator up as well as the AG, how much of those Senate races will need to have legs.
I think you're right on that.
I wanted to get your thoughts because it's timely, and you alluded to it. Texas is still going to be a hard place for Democrats to pick up statewide, but there is a runoff primary between the incumbent Ken Paxton and George P. Bush, who's I believe the state agriculture commissioner, I want to say, and headed to a runoff. Any prognostication that you think that you want to give on the outcome of that primary?
I think with a lot of the issues that Ken Paxton has faced in terms of legal issues and the like, losing staff, I mean, all of that stuff factors into that runoff nomination. And I think, it'll be an interesting race to watch. Obviously, George P. Bush is an incredibly popular Republican there and has had a very successful political career. And certainly name ID isn't a problem for him. So I think he could give Ken Paxton a hard time.
It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I know that General Paxton has long had a strong support in the conservative wing of the Republican Party, particularly there in Texas. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out.
Yeah, he certainly has a base that's going to stick with him. The question is whether his problems that he's had in the past couple of years and whether the name ID and popularity of George P. Bush will rule the day.
Let's talk about another state that I know, apropos of our conversation about Nevada, pardon me. I don't need to make the folks there correct me on my pronunciation.
You got to say it the right way, Stephen.
Right. Yeah, I got it. I corrected myself. Nevada. Yeah, right. Exactly. But when we talked about, a state that's going to be impacted by the other statewide candidates on the ticket, let's flip the script and look at Georgia. Here you have an incumbent Democratic senator, Raphael Warnock. You have an incumbent Republican governor who's getting primaried to his right. And of course, you're going to have that, down ballot AG race. How do you see that all playing out?
So I think what we're going to see there is, a tremendous turnout in Georgia, right? You have the Senate seat, you have the gubernatorial seat, and, Chris Carr down ballot has done a great job as Attorney General, has, he's done a great job there in Georgia. The question is, does he get caught in the crossfire there? I think he's done well enough and has, kind of raised the profile of himself and that office in a very good way as Attorney General. I think he ends up winning that race ultimately. But I think if there's any race in the country that you're seeing the Democrats sink some money into, especially with the state senator Jen Jordan,
right,
getting in there, I think that's something that Carr has to be worried about. But I do believe Georgia is starting to trend back red again. We have a wave year, and I think Carr is going to be just fine.
It's interesting. This is one of the races that I look at and can see, as I alluded to with North Carolina and Pennsylvania and then Virginia, where actually I could see Chris Carr getting a higher vote share than either of the Republicans for governor or Senate.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right about that. But
it's going to be interesting. Looks like obviously Senator Warnock is back up. Stacey Abrams running for governor. It's possible, and they got a strong, hardworking candidate in Senator Jordan running for AG. It's possible that Senator Warnock and Stacey Abrams have coattails. And so, to your point, I think a lot of money is going to get spent here. I think it is going to be a phenomenally put together ground game. I think there's going to be a lot of door knocking in that state, a lot of phone calls in that state, a lot of text messages in that state. And that's going to be a bellwether for some of these purple states going forward.
Yeah, and Stacey Abrams has certainly built quite a grassroots operation there in Georgia. And I think that cannot be underestimated going into this race. And it's going to be turnout. And I think Georgia is going to have a big turnout this year for a midterm election.
We have two states that I think that are worth mentioning and keeping an eye on, not for the potential to flip, but just because there are two states that have taken nationwide leadership on some multi-states and clearly in some policy pushing forward, and that's Massachusetts and Maryland. I don't see either of these states flipping to Republican control, but I think these are going to be two hard-fought primaries, and it will be interesting to see who's going to pick up the mantle of Maura Healey and Brian Frosch moving forward. I think it's, in Massachusetts especially, you have Quentin Palfrey. Quentin was the Democratic nominee for lieutenant governor in 2018, so has himself name recognition. And then you also have a city council person from Boston who ran for mayor, Andrea Campbell, I believe is her name. And so I believe that's also going to be a hard-fought race. And then in Maryland, Anthony Brown is running, as well as a Baltimore judge. And so that's going to be another, really, really Katie Curran O'Malley. And so it's going to be another hard-fought race, kind of a PG County versus Baltimore City, Baltimore County based race. And all four, Massachusetts and Maryland respectively, are very qualified individuals who I think are ready to step into the leadership vacuum of their predecessors.
The other state that could be a swing year for the Republicans is Wisconsin. And I think that's largely because we have a year where states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin are going to be front and center in terms of swing states. I think you're going to, the turnout model and the generic ballot being in favor of Republicans could be another win for the Republicans and an upset there.
Yeah, looking at that whole region, Josh Call, Wisconsin, Dana Nessel in Michigan, Keith Ellison in Minnesota, and as we talked about earlier, Iowa, that whole Midwest is becoming more and more of a battleground. I think without exception, each one of those AGs in their first term, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, have all worked extremely hard. And right now, most polls are showing them with kind of a 5 to 6 point lead and with net and significant favorability, which obviously bodes well. But I don't think you can look at any race, any statewide race in any of Michigan, Wisconsin, or Minnesota at this point and not see them as going to be hard-fought races within a couple points one way or another.
Yeah, another place where just kind of wrap it up on our side of it, you are going to see a switch in Arkansas, but just switch from one Republican to another. Leslie Rutledge is running for lieutenant governor, and Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin is the favorite to be the Republican nominee there, and will likely win that one in a walk.
They're switching roles.
That's right. That's right. And Sarah
only in Arkansas.
Sanders will be the governor there. So, but I do, that's one worth noting that you're going to have a switch. It's just not from Republican to Democrat. It'll be Republican to another Republican.
What are your thoughts on Arizona?
I think Arizona, I think that remains red. I think, the Arizona is trending more back to where it was, prior to 2020. I think, while, 2020 didn't go the way of the Republicans, I do think it's trending back that way. And internal polling shows that the political environment there is pretty good and it's improved for Republicans, and that the Republican nominee there should have somewhat of an advantage going into the race. But, open seat, we'll see how that goes.
I think Arizona, similar to Georgia, but in a very different way, it's going to be a unique indicator because I think at the top of the ticket, I think Mark Kelly is looking very strong in his reelection to the Senate. And so the question is going to be, do split ticket voters still exist? I think the conventional wisdom is that is less and less. But again, all politics is local. And so it'll be interesting to see with an open AG seat how that plays out and whether folks are running to be people's lawyer, whether they're running to be top cop, whether they're running to be the consumer protection czar, and to see how those subject matter issues play out at the ballot box, or whether or not this is just a straight ticket state.
No, that's right. Well, I think that pretty much covers it, Stephen. Any parting thoughts on this going forward, other than the fact that you're going to get lumped up again on your side of the aisle this year?
I got faith in our incumbents. I think they're doing a great job. I look forward to seeing them out on the campaign trail. It's going to be interesting, and I encourage everybody to keep a close eye, because state attorneys generals play such a vital role in the day-to-day in communities' public safety and in corporate regulatory efforts. So it continues to be a vitally important position. And so I hope folks who aren't involved or aren't paying attention to these races do so.
And I just encourage everyone to listen in again as we continue to interview attorneys general from around the country and touching on issues that both folks in their states care about, but the business community and business climate in general cares about. So thank you for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
This has been another installment of Holland Knight's Eyes on Washington podcast, State Attorneys General Edition. We look forward to having you next time.
Thank you for listening to an Eyes on Washington podcast, brought to you by Holland and Knight's Public Policy and Regulation Group. For more information on our Public Policy and Regulation Group, please visit hklaw.com/PPR.